I wanted to thank you all for coming today. We have a slide presentation that goes along with this discussion, but the most important part of what is going on is actually coming from us and not the visual aids. So I wanted to introduce all of you to my co-host in this, Christina.
Hi, everyone.
And my name is Jenna Poilaren. I am serving as an ambassador for the chapter UNA-USA LA, where I work to engage with local leaders, whether it's in leadership positions within government or business leaders around the greater Los Angeles area. Our work is to expand equality and the rights of women and girls, whether locally or globally, but as they say, a lot of it starts at home. Christina, can you just say a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm a recent graduate from law school with a specialization in international comparative law. During my studies, I participated in a human rights program in Uganda, and I am hoping to join the upcoming delegate roundtable in representing Ethiopia through the UN Women's Chapter Group.
Presents many dynamic meetings, talks, lectures. They have events like we're going to have the annual assembly soon, where they have workshops, and going online, we've been able to expand the content that we're able to do. But by expanding that content, we're taking risks. And in that, we bring up sometimes difficult topics that can trigger you, bring up an emotional response that might be unexpected. So I want to invite all of you to take a moment to look at the guidelines and understand that we're coming here together in peace and with caring at the basis of what we're doing. And we understand that there may be content that pulls a response we didn't expect. Now, you've already met my partner, Christina, and I. We hope to get you through this journey. We're going to cover a lot of information and also experiences of what's going on. And I will be relaying the most up-to-date content reported from the UN and their agencies about what's going on in the ground, because I know many of our audience is Ethiopian, and as well as having family in the region, we want to be considerate of that and give you the most pertinent information that is the most current. This is an overview of what we're going to cover. We've already covered a lot of it already just with the welcome, and now we're going to go into what UN Women is itself. We're going to go over the background of what's going on in Ethiopia. Christina will walk you through some of the country's history, along with the timeline of the crisis. Just so we know that many of you do know, but for those that are coming into this new, we want you to be up with us. Then I'll talk about the humanitarian aid going on, boots on the ground, and specifically what this crisis does to affect women and girls specifically, because it is amazing when you find out that UN Women is one of the only organizations that addresses women and girls' needs specifically. As you heard, that UN Women USA is an independent nonprofit. We work to share information about what's going on with women globally and locally. But I wanted to tell you about UN Women itself. UN Women works closely with civil society organizations, member states, and UN agencies, along with others to increase women's rights and participation in the peace process. We get gender into the mainstream conversation when no one else does, because there are millions of migrants out there and half of them are women. Today, when you look at the number of refugees in the world, did you know that 50% were women and girls? We make up half. And if you've ever had a sister, a wife, a friend, a mother, you know some of our needs are different. UN Women offers programs for women in peace and security. It supports peace building. It helps to end gender discrimination. And we even work to train peacekeepers on how to spot and stop abuse when they find it towards women. To go on, we're going to lead you in with Christina, who will tell you a bit more about Ethiopia and the background of what's going on.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining UN Women USA LA chapter as we uncover the current conflict in Ethiopia and the effect it has on women and girls. For some of you who do not know where Ethiopia is, it is located in East Africa. Ethiopia is a vast and diverse country with 80 different ethnic groups and 86 individual languages, Amharic being the official language of Ethiopia today. Tigrayans are just 5% of Ethiopia's 110 million population. A UNICEF report revealed that 34% of Tigrayan women are head of their households, and that they are also more likely to live in poverty than men. In fact, 43% of the women lived in monetary poverty compared to 22% of the men. The food poverty rate in Tigray is the highest of all regions, with a quarter of the women living in food poverty. UN Women has worked in Tigray through the Leave No Woman Behind program, providing a holistic approach to the various dimensions of women's economic empowerment, access to reproductive health, adult literacy classes, and training on the basic of income generation. In just this year alone, there have been 147 ethnic clashes throughout the region of Ethiopia, and over 3 million people have been displaced due to ethnic violence. The ongoing law enforcement operation that was announced on social media on November 4th, just before the shutting off of telecommunications in Tigray, has displaced 1 million Tigrayans who were forced from their homes. There are thousands believed to be dead. The UN reported that they have 49,370 civilians from Tigray region that are registered in Sudan, most of them being women and children. In fact, 45% of them being children. The number was increasing daily on average of 4,000 refugees until reports from refugees revealed that Ethiopian soldiers were blocking the border with Sudan, leading to a sharp decline of new arrivals. UNICEF shared that due to the conflict, 2.3 million children are in urgent need of assistance in Tigray, and thousands or more at risk in refugee camps. The UN Refugee Agency and partners have reported that access to camps on the border have become difficult due to safety concerns. The head of the UN Rakoba refugee camp has expressed concern about food shortages and the difficulty providing meals to arriving refugees. The media has revealed the dire conditions of women and children. Women have reported leaving with nothing but the clothes on their backs, with the children in tow, walking for days to reach Sudan, seeing dead bodies on the roads, giving birth on the road, and then getting right back up in fear that a soldier may find them. Vulnerable children fleeing on their own, being exposed to exploitation and trafficking. In the refugee camps, child-friendly spaces have been set up. These spaces provide psychosocial support and group learning spaces to keep up with their homework. However, as reported by the Save the Children director in Sudan, Arshad Malik, girls in particular are at risk of exploitation and need protection. To better understand what's happening in Tigray right now, it is important to know the history of the Tigrayan people. The people of Tigray have suffered and sacrificed for Ethiopia for decades. We would not be able to call the Ethiopia we see today Ethiopia if it was not for the battle against Italy in 1896, better known as the Battle of Ottawa, a town located in Tigray, which secured Ethiopia's independence and made it the only country in Africa not to be colonized. The people of Tigray survived the famine of the 80s when the leading regime deliberately withheld food from the region, according to reports. In 1998, they fought again on the front lines of a border war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Now they're forced to leave their homes and the lives that they fought to sustain. Some have even been forced to return to the very same camps they occupied during the 80s famine. Now, over 20 years after the worst famine of the region, they are facing challenges today due to the law enforcement operation. Food rations for displaced people in Tigray have now run out due to the current humanitarian crisis. There were 600,000 people in Tigray who depended on food relief assistance prior to the conflict. Tigray is also home to 96,000 refugees, half of them consisting of families who also depend on aid, not only for food, but shelter as well. However, due to the 6-month mandate, telecommunications being shut off, and blockage of air travel as well as road access, it has made humanitarian operations impossible. Just recently, a UN truck occupied by UN aid workers and security team that was seeking access to Shimbella camp, where Eritrean refugees were, was shot at by Ethiopian soldiers, and UN aid workers were detained. UN trucks carrying necessary supplies are currently stuck at heavily guarded borders. 2020 has been a difficult year for many of us, but it has taken a toll on the people of Tigray, who are already dealing with the worst locust outbreak in decades. The outbreak has threatened the livelihood of 80% of its residents, who are subsistence farmers that depend on their own farm produce for survival. Millions are now facing food insecurity. They are also experiencing the impacts of COVID-19. In this month alone, Ethiopia has over 100,000 confirmed coronavirus infections. The conflict in Tigray threatens a quicker spread of COVID in the region as people flee their homes. While soap and 50,000 masks have been sent from Sudan's capital for distribution at major entry points, the steady rise in numbers of new arrivals are reported to be significantly compromising COVID protective measures and aid efforts. About a little over a week ago, the Ethiopian government made a deal with the UN to give humanitarian aid workers unimpeded access into the region of Tigray in order for them to give critical aid to millions of people. However, the United Nations has expressed concern that access into the region remains significantly constrained. As of this morning, the European Union, in response to the humanitarian crisis in Tigray, has postponed 90 million euros in budget support payments to Ethiopia. Before we get any further, I would like to make something clear about this discussion. The primary focus of this non-political event is to bring the focus back onto the most vulnerable and impacted by the ongoing conflict in Tigray region, women and children. We will focus on the humanitarian priorities needed in Tigray and what the UN has called for, which are the following: the protection of civilians, including the safety and security of women and children, as well as ensuring the safety of aid workers and giving them unimpeded access into the region of Tigray so that they can provide critical aid to the people.
So this is my story. I was helping my family, and here I am because of the trouble became very, very expanded, very, very dangerous. And here I am in Hamdait. I crossed the border because of the war. If we were in our city, it would be very, very, very dangerously. So right now here, at least we are safe. At least we are safe. We didn't hear any kind of explosion. We didn't hear any kind of weapons. We are here very safe, actually. But actually, there's a lot of challenge right here because when we trying to escape, we didn't take any kind of luggage or baggage. We just only escaped, and we have no any kind of blanket and something carpet because we are just only scared and trying to escape to Sudani, to Hamdait. We never expected to be refugee. We never expected to see those shelters. We never expected. Everyone never expected for these things because we were in a very safe condition. We were in our developing, everyone trying to help family, everyone works, everyone studies, some of them work is help family. We never expected to be refugee. We never expected. I can tell you for sure, 100%.
You can see where we are. We're, like Christina said, dealing in a situation where people have gone a month without electricity, running water, cash, and telecommunications. And now the cash plays a big part in this, and I want it to be very clear. Cash means mobility. It means if you don't have money to get someone in a car to the border, if you don't have the ability to buy anything once you're there, it leads to more desperation. People are leaving with what they have. And having been without electricity and these necessities, it's actually triggered huge shortages of food, water, fuel, of course. And it's not just affecting the hundreds of people in the region, it's also affecting the humanitarian aid workers based in the region. And those that have find that the food prices have in some places doubled, tripled, and now women are finding themselves also in areas walking 15 miles to get water. Those 15 miles put them at risk of violence. Those 15 miles put them at risk of being killed or potentially raped just to fetch water. Women are often also the first responders. The first numbers coming in were primarily women and children, because that's what families do. Take the kids and go. Women are also crucial for communities. They're the ones that take the roles that support and sustain the communities they're in. In the region, doctors and nurses have had to suspend most routine care and a lot of critical care. This means the basic care that's needed to give birth to a baby. We're finding women in the capital that have died because of basic care not being available. The UN reported that about 60% of preventable maternal deaths come from these kind of crisis situations. And then refugees, often 1 in 5 women have experienced sexual violence. 1 in 5. Humanitarians like the UN and the agencies and the organizations that they're working with have increasing concern for the well-being of refugees currently in the region of conflict. We have approximately 96,000 Eritrean refugees. Many haven't been able to make contact with the camp. UNHCR has not been able to reach out to their own staff. There's a lack of access in communication, a lack of access to bring supplies. UN food stocks were supposed to run out at the end of November. The end of November, and today is the 16th of December. The UN convoy with supplies and to move hundreds of wounded people is ready to go to the capital of the region, but they haven't been able to get approval from the Ethiopian government. The UN High Commission for Human Rights, Michelle Blanchett, they have corroborated information that gross human rights violations, abuses, and serious violations of international humanitarian law, and including indiscriminate attacks, have resulted in civilian casualties, destruction of civilian infrastructure, looting, abductions, sexual violence against women and girls, as well as forced recruitment, making young men fight against their own community. There's also reports now that aid workers have been attacked and there has been a fatality. The UN and humanitarians call for the unconditional, unfettered, safe humanitarian access to the whole region. Meanwhile, the federal government of Ethiopia has confirmed that a UN team was shot at and detained near one of their own refugee camps. We're here today to support UN Women USA's emergency fund. Because women are on the front lines of the crisis, being the first to respond. They're also the majority of refugees and migrants. UN Women USA's programs is one of the few that works to engage women with the solution makers to prevent and to create a more healing, holistic approach that is inclusive for women and protects girls from the violence that they can encounter. But we have good news. Recently, on December 1st, it was announced of a more solidified formal partnership between UNHCR, the refugee agency, and UN Women. There will be expanded work done to help women, refugees, and those migrants. This is essential because women are at risk and we don't want them, when seeking shelter, to find themselves still at risk.
Our first panelist is Dr. Tsaga Iyasu. She is a mixed methods researcher specializing in the field of global health and has worked various governmental and non-governmental agencies, including the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Our next panelist is Mr. Samuel Gabru. He is an Ethiopian American social entrepreneur, community organizer, and managing director of Black Lion Strategies. And our final panelist is Maaza Gide. She is the co-founder of the Yukono movement in Tigray, which advocated for equality of women during the COVID crisis. She was able to establish emergency shelters and is currently sheltering 24 women and children. This first question is for Dr. Tsaga Gebreyesu. We know that women and girls are disproportionately affected during crisis. In an interview conducted in the Kassala region refugee camps, aid workers reported the lack of medical supplies, access to medical care, and food shortages due to the growing number of refugees. Expectant mothers are also at risk. Dr. Tsaga, what are women and girls likely to be experiencing in Sudan, including during passage within the camps?
So I can speak a little bit based on my experience doing research among women, also Tigrinya-speaking women, but from the other side of the border, who traveled through Sudan, a lot of them through Kassala. There's a huge risk of human trafficking. The number of people that were abducted and sold for ransom to the Sinai Peninsula is innumerable. There are an unknown number of bodies that were dropped there with their organs removed. Sexual slavery was a huge issue there as well. The ransoms that were being requested for people who were sold were upwards of $40,000 US. This bankrupted families throughout the diaspora. That's something I want to talk about. These kinds of wars are emotionally and psychologically debilitating to those that are directly affected. It's also debilitating to those that are indirectly affected. It's important to remember that these women are indigenous to this area. They're being removed from their indigenous land, and that they've seen this kind of conflict not once, but many times before. Mm-hmm. And this kind of a circumstance, these kinds of circumstances are actually ripe for re-traumatization, actually, because they've lived through these kinds of conditions before: politically motivated famine, rape, sexual violence, pregnancies from those rapes and sexual violence, something we don't talk about. What happens to those women psychologically, giving birth to the child of a perpetrator. Food insecurity in the camps is a huge issue. With food insecurity, what does that do? With women often being the main providers, the breadwinners, it pushes them into the informal work sector. What happens to people in the informal work sector in the United States, we can imagine, with all of the legal institutions in place. Depending on what country you're in, those protections may or may not be available. Who you are within the society that you're living in can also put you at a heightened risk. If you don't meet whatever criteria it is for a woman that is worthy of protection. A lot of these women, I know you all saw in the video, people have either seen their families killed or been separated from their families. These are the ones that are displaced, like leaving their home country, right? They're in Sudan now. The absence of your social networks, your social support system, both formal and informal, is extremely dangerous. It puts you at risk for a number of different things. And we're talking about rural populations largely. Mm-hmm. There are issues of literacy. There are issues of linguistic competency when you're crossing international borders. You may or may not speak the local language. That puts you at a disadvantage. A lot of people, because of the desperation in the camps, based on what we saw with our brothers and sisters on the other side of the border who left, mm-hmm. they end up moving on, secondary migration. They end up going to Libya, trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea. The number of people that drowned in those seas, we know. Mm-hmm. So there are a number of things. Making it to the camp is just one stage. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of things that we're going to see. And I just want to emphasize that the direct and indirect impact of armed conflicts are economically devastating, socially, emotionally, politically debilitating for its survivors. and those that love them. And these effects are cumulative. It's not like you survive one stage and it's all good and you get a reset and you get to start over. It's cumulative and it's intergenerational. A number of us on this panel and in the audience are in the diaspora as a result of these kinds of armed conflicts. I hope I answered your question.
This question is for Maaza. Women interviewed at the camps reported leaving with nothing but the clothes on their backs, kids in tow, walking for days without food or water to get to Sudan. In your opinion, what can governments in general do to improve on protecting vulnerable women and children?
First of all, thank you for organizing this event. It would help us to shed light on some of the atrocities that women are going through because of this political issue that's happening back home. In addition to what Dr. Zegga said, in order to stop all those kind of and more atrocities and pain that women are enduring, I think governments could first of all help in putting an end to the nonsensical war. Because unless that war is stopped, no matter what kind of protection is provided to women, there is still going to be some women and young girls suffering somewhere in parts of the war zone. So what we demand from governments is to use their leverage and to bring the warring parties to the negotiation table, because the root cause of this conflict or this war is political, and political issues cannot be resolved through guns. And so to do that, both warring parties need to be forced to come to the negotiation table. That's the only way we can protect our women. But in the meantime, first of all, we want to show our appreciation to the Sudanese government for opening their shelters and homes and giving refuge to our people, to the vulnerable women. But at the same time, it's important that refugees are protected wherever they are, because we have been hearing reports where women and refugees in Sudan, including women, are being forced to return back to Ethiopia. Had Ethiopia been safe for them, they wouldn't have traveled miles and leave their houses behind, their families behind, and seek refuge in Sudan. So I think the Sudanese government and elderlies and religious figures in that area can protect refugees, including women, by making sure that their full consent is taken into consideration whenever decisions are made. So that's the one thing governments could do. But in addition to that, I think governments globally could provide funding to agencies that are working on providing much needed humanitarian assistance, so that they can be able to provide shelter, protection, and other necessities that women need at this time point.
You brought up an important point that I noticed, the forced return. That's something that we've noticed happening in other regions as well. People not ready to return and they're forced to return. And sometimes they return to a house that's occupied by somebody else. There's also a lack of protection for them. So that was a good point. Is there anybody else who would like to expand on what governments in general can do to improve on protecting vulnerable women and children?
Just want to piggyback off of what Maaza said. It's super important. This kind of humanitarian intervention is not going to solve the root of the problem. It's a short-term bandage on a very deep wound. These women being an asylum seeker anywhere is hard. Mm-hmm. No matter how well-meaning or well-intended a host government is, Sudan is going through its own crises internally, its own transition. So the most fundamental shift that needs to happen is what Maaza is saying. This needs to stop, and people need to be able to go back to their ancestral land, their indigenous land.
So I just wanted to hear out Dr. Zegga and Maaza. It's great to be here. Thank you for hosting this, and really shout out to you, Christina and Jen, and the whole team at UN Women Los Angeles. So a few things. One, to sort of just build off of what Dr. Zegga was saying earlier, you know, the reports that we're getting, especially from the refugee camps that are being set up in Sudan, they're pretty horrific. I mean, there are right now, there's a huge shortage of medicine, huge shortage of resources and cash. You know, UNHCR and others are strapped for resources right now. I was talking to some folks yesterday in Sudan, and there are over 900 women that are pregnant right now from Tigray that have crossed over. There have been dozens of births, including stillbirths. So we're seeing babies die, unfortunately. And there's just a lack of basic medicines. So yesterday, a colleague of mine reported that there was someone who unfortunately passed away from asthma attack, and just there was nothing to be done for him. So there's clearly a lot going on there. Not to mention also in Tigray, there's a horrific situation as well that I'm sure we'll get to later on in the conversation. And then to Maz's point, the crux of this is indeed a political conflict. And Dr. Tsaga is correct. What we're all doing, the humanitarian response is critical for sure, but it's only addressing the symptoms. And so for us to ensure peace for girls and women, but all the refugees as well, we do need an end to this conflict. These women are disproportionately suffering, of course, and women are really, the bedrock of families in Ethiopia, families in Tigray. And so when they are impacted, the whole family is impacted. About 45% of the refugees, now there's about 50,000 of them, a little north of 50,000. 45% of them are women and 43% of them are children. So, if we're not really addressing the causes that these women are facing, particularly I think the sexual violence, that's the sort of, for me, what's really just abhorrent about all of this. And this is pretty classic of warfare just across the world. And so if this is something that we can really work on addressing and pushing the warring parties to, engage in the mediation, and then also just getting aid into Tigray as well, I think that'd be really great to make sure that families have food, that they have cash, like Jen was saying earlier, and that they are free from violence and the threat of violence too.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that I have you, Sam, I'm going to get into the question for you. And I also want you to feel comfortable with whatever you do want to share and not share. You expressed your concern about your mother at the beginning of the conflict. There were over 1,000 citizens of various foreign countries who were trapped in Mekelle, 200 of them being aid workers. Tell us more about the process you went through to get in contact with your mother, the US Embassy, and what others can do to reach loved ones despite the challenges with the lack of telecommunications.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's the situation is extremely fluid right now in Tigray, as people can imagine. And so, there's a lot of there's a lot of miscommunication, disinformation happening right now, and with that also a lot of fear. Just a few things. One, for anyone that's tuning in now or that may be watching this later, if you are a citizen of the United States or of any foreign country, and you have a loved one in Tigray that is a foreign national, you really should be getting in touch with your country's embassy in Addis Ababa, in the capital of Ethiopia. Embassies are trying to coordinate evacuations with the United Nations. It's not, evacuations are messy. They're never clear, and they're never planned either, because it happens when all hell breaks loose. And so that is definitely true in the case of evacuating foreign citizens from Tigray. At the beginning of the conflict, there were between 1,000 to 2,000 US citizens in Tigray, and a little over 400 European citizens in Tigray, not to mention, hundreds of other citizens from India, China, Turkey, and other countries as well. And so evacuating all of these people has been, obviously the priority of their governments, but that hasn't always been clear cut just because of the violence. Things are changing by the day, but sort of as of now, the federal government has announced that it has reopened airspace in Tigray, and this has been closed for since the beginning of the war for the last 6 weeks. And so if that is indeed the case, then there's a sort of question about what sort of civilian aircraft will be allowed into Tigray, and sort of the safety of civilian aircraft. Evacuations so far have only been from Mekelle, from the capital, not from any other region. and evacuations have been through UN organized convoys. So people have been driven in buses. There's been, 200, 300, 400 people at a time that have gone from Tigray to Afar, the neighboring state. And then from Afar, they have been either driven or flown to Addis Ababa. And then from there, they're able to leave. But there's been a lack of communication. There have been very strong reports and experiences of foreign nationals of Tigrayan origin who have been harassed, intimidated, interrogated, ethnically profiled along the whole route, and then also at Addis Ababa's international airport. And so, this is something that also sort of just needs to be recognized and addressed. And so it's been a pretty, terrible process for a lot of people, including yours truly. I would suggest, in addition to reaching out to your country's embassy in Ethiopia, you should also be reaching out to your elected official. Your United States representative, your United States senator, they have a vested interest in the safety of their constituents, wherever they may be in the world. And they all have staff that handle constituent issues. And so they're able to put pressure on the US Embassy, the US Department of State, and also put pressure on the Ethiopian government to protect foreign nationals. But I'll say, if they're treating foreign nationals this way, then, what do you think Ethiopian citizens of Tigrayan origin are feeling? So, and they are the ones that don't have a foreign embassy or a foreign government to protect them necessarily. Right now, there's spotty cell service, mobile service in Mekelle and in other areas that are occupied by the federal government. Not every call goes through though, so I think it's important to just recognize. I mean, you may call dozens of times, but only a handful of calls may actually go through. Ethiopia has a very strong telecommunications and cybersecurity intelligence apparatus, and so a lot of Tigrayans have been afraid to communicate sort of what's happening on the ground, and that's certainly true with some of the sources that I'm communicating with. Just getting true and honest feedback and answers from them could put some people's lives in danger. And so just recognizing that that's an issue. It would have been great to have one of our fellow Tigrayans in Tigray on this webinar, but for obvious reasons, I don't know if that's possible. So, and
safety too.
Yeah, safety is super important. And so it's just, these are some of the issues, the ongoing issues. And I know Dr. Tsaga and Maza have probably have had their own experiences reaching out to loved ones in Tigray over the last few days and over the last few weeks. And so it's been really difficult. And I just want to recognize the trauma that a lot of us have been experiencing over the last 6 weeks. Not knowing, honestly, is worse than knowing. It's better if we're aware of what's going on the ground, as opposed to hearing rumors or news articles from time to time saying that there have been airstrikes here or bombings there or looting here or rapes here. It's very frustrating because your mind always goes to the worst case scenario.
Yes, and I also wanted to touch on just the issue of lack of telecommunications whenever there's a protest or instances such as this one. If you could expand on that.
Yeah, I'd love to actually throw that question to Maza as well with the activism that she and her colleagues have done throughout Tigray and Ethiopia. But I would just say, it's a pretty emblematic thing of the Ethiopian government to block telecommunications. It's happened consistently over the last 2 years, and it's a pretty horrific thing. But anytime that there's any sort of civil unrest or repression or protests going on, there's usually some sort of outage of internet or all telecoms. This past summer was sort of the most extreme example that we've seen, where there was a nationwide internet blackout in Ethiopia for about 1 month, in the month of July,
yes.
When the Ethiopian economy suffered over $100 million of loss. And so, that's just, not only does it hurt people in terms of communicating with loved ones, but the whole economy suffered.
Yeah, and also the effect on, investigations on humanitarian issues as well. Does anybody else want to expand on this issue?
Yeah, I would love to. particularly about the last point you made. It's making our advocacy even tougher than it should be, because we don't have any evidence to corroborate our claims with, and that I think that's done on purposefully. Like the government in Ethiopia purposefully shut down the connection so that the plight of the Tigrayan people, or those who are being primarily impacted by the war, their plight is not represented out there. And so now with international journalists or media outlets not being able to travel all the way to Tigray and to investigate what's happening, to report on all the distraction and atrocities that are being committed by the warring parties, it makes it very difficult even to mobilize global support and to bring relevant actors to the table so that they can pressure the warring parties and put an end to the war. So the fact that the internet is shut down and that it's non-existent makes it even much more harder, and it makes the Tigrayan people suffering even unbearable, because they're completely in the dark. They're being exterminated. They're being killed, bombed constantly without being able to tell what's happening to them. And I think this makes the conflict back home quite unique when you compare it to similar conflicts that might have happened in other parts of the world. We can look into what happened in Syria and other countries. At least they were able to record the incidents and to put it out there, because I think there were some private operators who had access to the internet and to telecommunication. But when it comes to Ethiopia, the internet and telecommunication provider is a government owned. And so the government has a full monopoly over the service. And so because of that, it makes it quite difficult. And this is why we're pushing for the international community, one, to put pressure on the Ethiopian government to reconnect Tigray. Just opening one phone line in Magale doesn't mean the whole region is reconnected, because Tigray is bigger than Magale, and also just a phone line that doesn't do service. We need to have the internet back so that we can see what exactly is happening. But in addition to that, international media corridor is of high importance, because the international media is believed to be neutral and is believed to have the capability that is required in order to independently investigate and report on everything that might have transpired over the last 45 days. And from what it seems, the war is going to continue for quite some time. And so that's where we need to work. Otherwise, if things remain the way they are right now, it's even going to be very difficult to report on what's happening, because of course we get some information whenever we try to call back home, but that doesn't have the kind of credibility that is needed in order to take it as a fact. And because of that, the suffering would continue, and that's not something we want.
Just across into Sudan, these are not paved roads. These are sand paths that they're following. And when they get there, they're often told that they need to get on a bus to go 16 hours to the nearest established camp. Now, when they get on the bus, they are often handed a mask, a simple medical mask. And we know how fragile those are. We've all had lots of experiences with masks now. They have one mask and 16 hours on a crowded bus. We must acknowledge the effects of COVID exacerbating this crisis. Many of them have actually decided to stay at the border and not go into a more established camp. We've reached 50,000 people now having crossed that border. But we find that we've actually, we've done numbers to find that we have about 43% women, 300-400 children that don't even have a parent with them. They were told to go and they went. Hundreds of unaccompanied children leads to dangers of human trafficking, violence. They face exploitation at such high levels, it's terrifying. The United Nations has set up family tracking services in the camp. They are trying to reconnect people. One thing we find out is a lot of people are trying to stay close to the border so they can go back and tend to their crops. For so many in the region, their crops is their main food source. Many of them are staying just to wait for a loved one to cross over so they can go together, trying to avoid the risk of losing contact. The United Nations has made these safe spaces so people can come and report the human rights violations that we've spoke of. Some of the information that we're getting back are from these safe spaces. It's where people can raise their concern, report problems, and the UN is trying to get them into the right specialized services and legal aid.
The UN's Children Agency reported that telecommunication blackout and the conflict has left 2.3 million children in Tigray in need of humanitarian assistance, and thousands of more at risk in the refugee camps. The director of the UNICEF described the conditions for refugee children as extremely harsh. Women reported having to give birth on the road, but having to get up immediately after giving birth because they were scared Ethiopian soldiers would find them. They also reported seeing dead bodies on the roads. Dr. Tsaga, in your opinion, what are the emotional and social effects of emergencies on adolescents as well as women who are traumatized by the Tigray conflict?
Okay, so we're going to talk again about those that are directly affected. There are different layers that we can think of. At the individual level, I don't know if you all noticed that there are a ton of elderly women crossing the border, many of whom are being carried. There's an unknown number of internally displaced populations who are likely living in extremely dire conditions. As was mentioned, I don't know if it was Maza or you, Christina, there was an economic impact as a result of COVID-19 and necessary interventions for that. There was one of the worst locust outbreaks in recent history. That was devastating crops. They were dealing with that. And in addition to all of that, they've had to leave their harvest during the time that they're supposed to, with basically nothing but the clothes on their back. So the economic devastation, in addition to already being contrary to popular misconception, some of the poorer people in Ethiopia, there's a myth flying around that all the people in Tigray are living large. It's not true.
Yes.
Women, as the kind of backbone of their families, they don't have access to their bank accounts. Those that have bank accounts, those that don't, again, their basic source of sustenance has been interrupted by 2 or 3 things prior to this conflict. Add flight, whether you had to cross an international boundary or you're traveling or migrating within. Another example that you provided was pregnant women. There's also the immunocompromised. You know, there are a number of people who are on medications for a number of other reasons, and they're unable to access the necessary medications that they need in order to survive. That includes people with HIV. That includes a ton of other conditions as well. The number of infants that will not survive this conflict is likely innumerable. You can't, it's one thing for an adult to have trouble eating. It's another thing for small children. I don't know if anyone remembers the story of the young woman who watched her parents murdered in front of her eyes. Apart from the psychological damage that's been done, there are going to be lasting social and economic impacts on that young girl's life. This conflict has fundamentally shifted her opportunities. At the interpersonal level, we're going to see a rise in gender-based violence, because when people are stressed out, they take it out on the only people that they feel that they have control over. And that's often, in their families. At the interpersonal level, a lot of people saw their husbands, their fathers, their children, sometimes their children murdered. What does that do for the financial stability of a family? The dismantling, I talked a little bit about, like, social institutions, whether it be formal or informal. People go to, this is a very, an ancient people and a very pious people, whatever their religious background. They look to their religious institutions for psychological support in dealing with all of the challenges that they've had to endure in their lifetimes. These institutions have been interrupted. The interruption of leadership has a severe impact on one's sense of morale, in addition to the financial and the economic hardship that people are experiencing. Their businesses are not operating. You know, there was apparently the federal government saying, go back to work. Do you think people feel comfortable when they see people being shot after 6 p.m. because curfew's over? The devastation of factories that was a source of support for a lot of women. That was their way of feeding their families. The devastation is innumerable. And that's not even adding all the people in the capital, Addis Ababa, who've been removed from work for no reason other than their ethnic background.
Thank you, Dr. Tsaga. Does anybody else want to touch on?
And Christina, in our culture, elders depend on the youth to survive.
Yes.
Right? If you have swaths of young people being massacred or being economically, socially, psychologically destabilized, think of the impact on older women. It's unbelievable.
And I know there's many people who have probably PTSD from past similar events, probably. Is there anybody that would like to expand on the emotional and social effects this has on children and women?
Yeah, I'd love to add a few things here. Dr. Tsaga mentioned religion. One of the articles that had circulated, I think maybe this was like a week or two ago, I think it was from the New York Times, had a photo of a particular church in Sudan that Tigrayan refugees had used back in the 70s and 80s during the Ethiopian Civil War. And this church had closed because refugees had either gone to other countries or they had returned to Tigray. And that same church has now been reopened. That reading that just broke my heart, thinking that these places that Tigrayans thought that they had sort of left behind and were in the rear view were now places that they were going back to again. And, I think Dr. Tsaga, you mentioned at the beginning about how, many of us are in the diaspora because of prior conflicts. And, what is really just tragic about all of this is to see, in particular, these high numbers of children, girls, of women, of elderly women in particular, becoming refugees and sort of, walking in the same steps that we thought we left behind 30, 40 years ago. And so it's really tragic to see a repetition of history, and a backtracking of gains that have been made. I would suggest people on this call to read the recently released United Nations Human Development Report. 2020 report talks about the incredible gains that have been made in Ethiopia from 1990 to 2019. And there's some really interesting facts in there about the economy, about sort of social and human development, but also about some progress that was made in terms of child health and gender issues as well. And then just very lastly, one thing that's just like really striking, if you read some of the UN humanitarian reports coming out of these refugee camps, out of the 50,000 or so Tigrayan refugees, only about 18,000 of them have actually been resettled. The rest of them are still in the border areas, refusing to really move because they're waiting to relocate with family, to reconnect with family, or they're hoping to be able to go back and check on their crops or check on their properties. So there's still this like longing for home, longing for sanctuary, and this idea that Sudan, as hospitable as a place and as a people that they are, is not home. And so what refugees are going through, in particular what women are going through, what mothers are going through, it's just unnormal, it's unnatural, and we have to recognize it as such.
Yeah, I actually would like to tell a personal story that highlights how devastating the impact is on women. My own sister-in-law, she was pregnant before the war, and 2 weeks into the war, because the city that she was based in was constantly being bombed and shelled. So she, I think it increased her blood pressure and she had to give birth prematurely. And she had to go through C-section. And after that, all hospitals were looted, everything was destroyed. And so she still hasn't recovered from the wounds of her surgery. And that's mainly because the doctors, she cannot get any kind of health service. And her newborn, they have nothing to feed their newborn. So they have the baby and they're just waiting for the baby to die or to survive out of lack. They have nothing to feed the baby with. And the mom, she newly delivered a baby through C-section, and she doesn't even have access to the medication that's necessary for her wounds to recover. And so people are not just dying of bullets, they're dying of hunger, they're dying of very acute shortage of medical service and medication. And the suffering of women through this conflict or within this war it's unheard of, because people are not just, it's not only those who have fled the war zone that are being highly impacted, it's also those who decided or couldn't leave the war zone because military forces have already blocked the passage, and that's a war crime, that constitutes war crime. But even ignoring the war crime aspect of it, people are just still sitting at home waiting for their deaths and for their innocent children's deaths because they have nothing to feed their kids. And that, I just wanted to share this story and to show how harrowing and devastating the impact of this war is.
Thank you, Maza. I'm going to move on now to the next question. This question is for Sam. Sam, as a male feminist, how do you feel other men can stand up and support women, especially during a crisis?
First, Maza, thank you for sharing that story. That's incredibly personal and vulnerable, and I just want to appreciate you for that. The reality is, over the last 15 years, Ethiopia, through its health extension program, which has been, hailed internationally, has deployed, public health workers, health extension workers to all villages and communities in rural areas throughout the country. And that whole system has been disrupted, right? And so whether it is safe childbirth or other preventative care, vaccines for children, all of that is suspended right now. And so it's devastating to see what people are going through. And it's worth noting, over 30,000 health extension workers were deployed. All of them were women. And so that's an incredible program that's disrupted right now. I think a few things for my fellow men in this call. I would say, first and foremost, never expect a trophy or a gold sticker for showing up and sort of doing the bare minimum. I think it's important to step up. And this is true whether it is sort of with gender inequality or gender inequity or any other sort of systems of oppression, whether it's race or class or whatever. I think people who have any level of privilege, whatever privilege that may be, whether it's your gender, your financial status, whatever, I think it's important to do two things in particular. One, it's to create space to make space. So sort of learning how to step back when necessary, and also knowing how to validate or to sort of back to second what's going on. I think it's important to provide cover sometimes for people to be able to feel safe to express their views. So I think it's important that we create those safe spaces, but then also I think what's important too is to show a sense of solidarity and co-leadership, right? In the US, we talk a lot about how it's not enough to just be an ally, you have to be a co-conspirator. And that's the sort of idea, whether it comes to racial justice or gender justice or, issues with LGBTQ people or whatever. I mean, there's so many, to Dr. Tsaga's point, there are people who are HIV positive that are being impacted by this. There may be LGBTQ individuals that we, don't know of that are being impacted by this. So, I mean, the impacts of this war, we will not fully know or understand for some time because of the blackout that Tigray is experiencing. There's just so much that we don't know. And I think it's just important that we use our privilege, especially as men, to highlight issues that we may not experience ourselves directly, but that are important to us. And just lastly, a problem doesn't have to be your problem for it to be important. And I think stepping up and addressing things that impact all people, particularly gender-based violence, particularly issues facing girls and women, because we do know that they are disproportionately impacted through war and violent conflict, that we step up and provide that. So that's just not, money, but also raising awareness and providing co-leadership to struggles. I think that's really important.
Thank you, Sam. This question is for Maaza. Ethiopia's new cabinet is 50% women. The Defense and Ministry of Peace is led by women, yet they've been very quiet when it comes to this conflict. Are the voices of women, even in high-level leadership, valued?
I'm very glad you raised this question because it's very important. First of all, that data is inaccurate. Most of the women ministers have been removed or dismissed right after the Prime Minister got the Nobel Peace Prize. I think right now there are only about 31% or so women cabinet members. So that number has decreased, with most of them, as I said, being demoted or removed. And in addition to that, it's important to see, what do we mean by empowering women? Do we give space to women that are truly capable and truly capable to speak to power, or do we give power or space to those who only agree with our opinions and to those who only take orders and implement them? So what we see in Ethiopia is women that are only loyal to the political party, women that only agree with the political party of the leadership being crowned upon or getting all the spaces that you see them occupying. And so during this war, and even before the war was waged on Tigray, the women cabinet members had an opportunity to play a very critical role in making sure that peace was maintained in the country. But instead of doing that, we saw them being very instrumental in legislating laws and in and they were actively participating in the warmongering behavior of the central government. And so, no, they're not speaking up for women. All of them are either silent or they're actually actively supporting the war. Case in point, the Minister of Peace just recently was raising funds that would actually finance the war. So it's quite shameful to be a woman, and at the same time to lead a ministry that was supposed to cultivate the culture of tolerance and listening to one another and being able to solve problems through dialogue and not guns. They have turned into Ministry of War, and they're financing the war. They're raising funds, and that very institution is led by women. So what I wanted to say here is the very important thing is women have been used to capitalize on the leadership that they were given by the federal government was not based on merit. It was rather based on political loyalty. And so they're serving to that political loyalty, not to lose it. So they're not helping women, vulnerable women who are actively being impacted by the war. They're rather fueling the war by raising funds and doing other things. And the other thing we can look into is how the Minister of Health was prematurely. She was giving an advice to the Prime Minister as to how he could hold the elections when COVID-19 was actually on its highest spike. This is after Tigray, the region of Tigray, decided to have their own election, and after they successfully did that. So it's just, for me, it seems like most of the female political leaders in Ethiopia are being used as political tools to implement policies and directions that directly came from the Prime Minister's office. I don't think they have any space to speak up or to give their own inputs. And even if they have, it's the same kind of input that comes from the male leadership part of the government.
Thank you, Maaza. Would anybody like to expand on this?
Yeah, I'd like to add something. Integrity is extremely difficult to find, and no gender or any particular type of person has a monopoly on integrity. That's the first thing. The second thing, same rule applies to competency. And the third thing is that women are often the ideological leaders that are guiding some of these policies as well, not just within the Ethiopian context, but across the world. Women can also be perpetrators or facilitators, active facilitators, even the ideologues behind the scenes of vast atrocities that we see happening around the world. So I don't know, I guess in the same way that men are being targeted for their gender, being shot in cold blood on the streets of Malala in different areas for fear that they might rise up someday, these sorts of things I don't think can be so gender or type of person specific. They may actually be actively involved, the ideologues behind things for whatever, ethnically motivated. I'm not sure exactly what's driving some of their motivations, but it's important to recognize that they are making choices. They know what they're doing. They're encouraging gaslighting. They're encouraging a number of the psychological damage that's being done by gaslighting victims for the violence that's being perpetrated against them is beyond offensive. It is profoundly disappointing.
Yeah, to add to that, I completely ditto to both of you. You know, among Black folks here in the US, we have a saying, you know, not all skin folk are kinfolk. And the idea is that just because you look like me, just because you may share the same skin color as me, does not mean that you operate in my best interests. And that's the same for women, for men, for any sort of identification. And so just because there was at one point a 50% women cabinet doesn't mean anything. You know, the real question to ask and answer is, you know, what is your integrity? What are the principles that you come with? And how do you speak truth to power, as both Dr. Tsaga and Maza said? You know, I think, you know, in addition to the Minister of Health and the Minister of Peace, and, you know, just by the way, Ministry of Peace is a misnomer. The Ministry of Peace oversees the intelligence and security services in Ethiopia. So, you know, I would actually call it Homeland Security more than anything, but, you know, Ministry of Peace is a euphemism. But, you know, I'm actually incredibly disappointed in the president of Ethiopia. Who, I mean, it's a symbolic position. It's a ceremonial position as the head of state. The real power is vested in the prime minister, according to the constitution. But, you know, the president of Ethiopia, the current one, is a woman. She's the only female head of state in the continent. You know, was sort of celebrated, you know, upon getting appointed by the parliament to this position. And, you know, as a former United Nations diplomat, career diplomat, and has provided no leadership in this crisis, and actually has harmed the people of Tigray through support of the war and through sort of just sheer indifference, but also actual actively harming through supporting the fundraising efforts that Maza spoke about with the Ministry of Peace, and then also through communicating with African leaders and the international community. And so I just, I'm very concerned about the status of the presidency in Ethiopia. I think this would have been a terrific time to see a female head of state sort of serve as the bridge builder, especially someone who's a diplomat, who's a career diplomat. You know, you would think you can bring skills with conflict resolution and mediation and really summon all of the warring parties to channel their better angels. And so I would have loved to see that. And it just breaks my heart that we're not seeing that right now.
Yeah, same here. I mean,
have great news. We are halfway to our goal. So big round of applause. Thank you. We have $1,530 donated via text message. We can get closer to our goal if you just pick up your phone and put in $5 more, $10 more. And the reason why I tell you this is it's not just for the services providing food, water, masks, but also an opportunity for justice. When the High Commissioner of Human Rights said that we have evidence, they've got what they need so that when this crisis is over, those that have committed these human rights atrocities can be held accountable in the world court. We are US citizens, and the US role within the United Nations has been dramatically affected in recent years. But we can say what we believe in, and that's through our dollars. I ask you, think about the safe spaces that the UN has created in the camp. It's allowing people to document while still able. People will perish during this crisis, but if we can get their witness testimony, we can gather it and hope to find justice for those harmed. Humanitarian aid workers are asking for peace. And I have to bring up the fact that COVID costs money. I don't know how many masks you have, but I seem to have quite a few, and the little medical ones break. And we're just trying to get people masks. How will we possibly get them tested? To help support is the UN Women USA LA Emergency Fund. You've heard their stories. These experts, these academics, these leaders and advocates are telling you how desperate the situation is. And we're not telling you you can't do anything. We're showing you how. So please join us in making this change. Let's reach our goal today. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your time.
Some of the questions from the audience. I know there were many questions, but we can do a few. So I'll start with the first one. We hear the Ethiopian government is offering a safe return of Tigrayan refugees in Sudan to their homes. Do you think the Ethiopian government can be trusted with this offer?
The answer is no, because people are fleeing from him and from forces loyal to him. And so he cannot be, I mean, the Ethiopian government can't be the perpetrator of the crimes that these people are trying to escape from, and at the same time play a savior. So these people of Tigray origin are fleeing their houses, their homes, the only place that they have known to be their home for how many years now. They're leaving their house, their family behind without anything on their hands, mainly because of the violence that was instigated by forces loyal to the Ethiopian government. And so they cannot go back to home until that conflict is stopped. And that conflict will not be stopped until the war is stopped. And so Ethiopian government cannot be trusted, not only to return back or to resettle Tigrans, but also to provide the humanitarian aid and everything that the Ethiopian government was signing with the UN. So, and another thing is from the reports we got recently, I think around 200 Tigrans have been forcefully returned to Ethiopia from refugee camps in Sudan, and they have been resettled in Amhara lands, not in their origin, not in their homes. So these people are being displaced internally, and that's not what people want. They, of course, everyone wants to go back home. It's not comfortable to live in a place that you have no idea, like without your family members, without your own social fabric that you're accustomed to. But they want to go back home only when it's safe for them to do so. And when the war on Tigray is actively ongoing, Tigray is not safe. Ethiopia generally is not safe for Tigrayans. And so the refugees should not be forced to return back. And those who have been forced to return back, I think the international community has the obligation to make sure that they successfully are returned back to the refugee camps in Sudan or elsewhere that is safer for them.
I also want to mention that they did mention having camps that were going to be used to help rehabilitate people before entering back to their regions that they're from. Does anyone want to touch on that as well? The rehabilitation camps that they've set up?
I'm not sure what that means, but just to sort of add on to what Maza was saying, just very quickly. Earlier this week, the International Organization on Migration, which is a UN agency, reported that one of its refugee centers in Addis Ababa was taken over by the Ethiopian military, which is just extremely unusual and breaks all sorts of norms established between the United Nations and host countries. This was a refugee processing center for Eritrean refugees. The United Nations has not been, through UNHCR, through the UN Refugee Agency, it has not been able to reach Eritrean refugee camps in Tigray. There are about 100,000 Eritrean refugees in Tigray. Dr. Tzaga mentioned earlier about sort of internally displaced people. I mean, Ethiopia last year had more internally displaced people than Syria, which is embroiled in a full-on civil war. It's important to remember the war on Tigray is not an isolated incident either. It's not violence happening in a vacuum. There are numerous clashes and internal displacements happening throughout Ethiopia. And so this is important that to resolve for all of this. And going back to the point of refugee resettlement, really, I mean, I think we need to let the United Nations lead on this. The United Nations is a trusted authority. It needs full, unconditional access to Tigray. We are hearing hearing reports that the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, and the World Food Program now have been able to access Tigray and provide some humanitarian aid. But it is important to remember that these convoys that they have are heavily guarded. Ethiopian military is escorting them. They do not have free movement, which is a concern. The UN is really alarmed by this, and they are protesting the treatment that they have experienced in Tigray at the hands of the Ethiopian government. And then also a week ago, aid workers were shot and killed. Aid workers, they do God's work and need to be given full access. I mean, every civilian life is important, but aid workers are there on a specific mission to support civilians. They are clearly marked. It's not like these are people operating covertly. They are clearly marked with clearly marked vehicles with uniforms on and need to be protected. This is international humanitarian law. And so, as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said, there are numerous instances, there's credible reports of a lot of war crimes happening and violations of humanitarian law. And so, we need to let the UN lead, and not just on the war in Tigray, but there needs to be a national inclusive dialogue among all political and armed groups in Ethiopia, because there's so much fighting and violence throughout the country going on in Oromia and Benishangul Gumuz and Afar and Gambela and in Sidamo, everywhere. And so finding opportunities for peace building and peacemaking is what we should be doing. And the UN has a very important role to play with all the experts and the intellectual capital that they have. So I think we just need to give them the space to lead, or rather the Ethiopian government needs to give them the space to lead.
Thank you, Sam. Dr. Tsaga, would you like to expand on that? No pressure.
No, I just want to reiterate what was said. There are a number of crises happening within Ethiopia. They've been occurring for quite some years now. This is not a new thing. Tigray has been blocked from the south for a few years now. The pogroms or massacres of Tigrayan civilians living in the Amhara region has been happening for a while. It's not a new thing. I would argue that while there are crises happening in different parts of the countries in which maybe more civilians in terms of absolute numbers are being affected, the systematic nature of this one, where people are being removed from their jobs, where people are being pulled off of airplanes because of their last names, where people are being enumerated and their homes are being raided, people are being detained. These are non-politically affiliated people. This has taken a level, it's taken new heights, and requires the kind of response necessary for something that seems like it's the prelude for something very, very devastating that we've seen in a number of different African countries and European countries in the 20th century. Something else that I think is important to highlight is, I'm not sure I remember whether Sudan is party to the Geneva Convention, but there is a policy called the policy of non-refoulement, which means you cannot take refugees back against their will anywhere. I know that we've seen this with Eritrean refugees, for example, being forcibly repatriated to Eritrea in the past. I'm not surprised that these behaviors are being mimicked if these reports are found to be credible. But that is against international law. That's something that I just wanted to highlight.
No, thank you. That's why it's important to give these humanitarian aid workers access so that they can investigate some of these potential international war crimes. I'm going to come now with the next question. How do you all see this ending, especially given that the Ethiopian government has repeatedly declined peace talk and is actively engaged in reported misinformation? And this, again, is an open question. Anyone can unmute and
I can start.
Okay.
Don't see it ending. Even when the post-conflict period begins, we're going to, what's happening in the city that we actually have information from, Ma'ala, is that the social disintegration that's happening due to the economic depression that's taking place is going to have lasting impacts. The impacts of a conflict like this, whether it be a month long or 2 years long, are long lasting. There will be many waves of migration. You can't just destroy the industrial infrastructure in a place and expect things to kind of pop back to a stable situation. The social, I don't see the impacts of the war. I see this lasting for decades, the impacts, the social, economic, psychological, and honestly political impacts of this conflict. The actual physical fighting, I don't know. I would imagine that it might be protracted on and off, because one of the fundamental reasons that you find a lot of Tigrayans feeling so devastated is not just the kind of destruction of the physical body or the physical infrastructure. It's a challenge to their very right to self-governance, which is something that they fought for a very, very long time.
Thank you, Dr. Tsaga. Would anybody else like to expand on this?
I would like to add some things. As Dr. Tsaga said, it's very difficult to imagine the ending point of this war, but at least the active war, the bombing and the shelling could be stopped if the international community, particularly the UN Security Council, takes an immediate action and intervene. What we see right now is IGAD or the African Union, they're basically trying to stop the case from reaching to the UN Security Council's table. And a lot of countries are saying we're doing this in order to let the African Union deal with African problems. However, the initiative that some of African leaders have taken to put an end to the war through mediation and peace talks has been ignored, mainly by the Ethiopian government. There has been multiple calls for peace talks and negotiation from the president of South Africa and other leaders. However, that call has been undermined, and the UN, the African Union as a collective intergovernmental institution has been undermined by the actions of the Ethiopian government. And so I don't see any hope whatsoever or chance that the African Union could play in putting an end to the war. However, the UN Security Council does have that power. They can do it through economic sanctions, arms embargo, or flight restriction on all warring parts. That way, when the purses of the warring parties, particularly the Ethiopian central government, is in danger, maybe then they will think twice before killing innocent people indiscriminately. And so that's one of the ways that we can put an end, at least an immediate end to the hostilities. But as Dr. Tsaga said, the impact is very overreaching. And especially the other solution that I would see is just because the UN intervenes and tries to bring peace and stability, I don't think that would be the case unless the fundamental constitutional right of the Tigrayan people to self-governance is respected. And that starts by restoring the government that they just elected a couple of months ago. Over 2.7 million Tigrayans have elected their own political representatives. And unless that political elected party is restored to Tigray and start administering its own people, I don't see any possibility how Tigrayans would actually remain in silence and be governed by somebody that they didn't vote for. As Dr. Tsaga said, one of the fundamental rights or principles that the Tigray people have fought for, not only in recent years, but throughout our history, is the right to self-governance and the right to self-administration. And so the Tigray people have paid very heavy price, and they have paid costly with their children's lives and bodies. And so I don't see them giving up that right now. So no matter how costly it would be, no matter how painful it would be, my fear is that people would continue to fight for that, and in the midst of it, civilians would be lost, lives would be lost. And to stop this, the international community needs to intervene, not only to avert the humanitarian crisis aspect of it, but also the falling part of the entire country and probably the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, you know, there there are only two guarantees in war: carnage and war crimes. That's it. And the longer each day that this war continues, the harder it becomes to find peace, to find resolution to the conflict. And you know, right now what we're seeing as well is that this war is indeed regionalized. It is an international war. It does not, it's not restricted to the boundaries of Tigray. There are numerous state actors that are involved, and solving for this as soon as possible is going to be important. But yes, you know, regardless of whether the immediate fighting ends tomorrow or today, the reality is that there's so much that needs to be done politically, socially, to rehabilitate Ethiopia as a country, but also particularly the fractured relations between Ethiopia's federal government and the people of Tigray. And so the longer this war continues, the harder that will be. And you know, when you look at Ethiopian history or Tigrayan history, just over the last century, to Maza's point, Tigrayans have stepped up twice through two major rebellions in the 40s and in the 70s. And so we do know, and you know, women were integral to both of these rebellions. And so women have played a very key role, also as soldiers too, as commanders of armies when they were doubted in their ability. They stepped up and led in enormous ways, and continue to lead within government and other positions. And so, you know, Tigrayan people as a whole, but in particular Tigrayan women, they do understand the sacrifice that was paid, because it was many of their children who went and fought for war, and many of them who you know, were pretty active in the struggles. So you know, it is very likely that this could end up being something protracted, something that goes on for months, if not years, unless the fighting stops soon. I want to thank the European Union for stepping up in enormous ways. And my hope is that the US, under the new administration that will be coming in about a month, will restore its global leadership. And hopefully at that point, we can see stronger action among the United Nations and other intergovernmental organizations.
Thank you, Sam. So at this point, I just want to leave it open between you guys. If there's something that you feel like that is important that we should bring up now. You know, anything we haven't covered yet. Sam, is there? No? Maaza?
I'll let Maza lead on that.
Okay.
I think it's important that people understand what's happening, or the crisis for what it is. And it is, at least from a Tigrayan perspective, it's systemic ethnic cleansing. It's not even just a war, because people of Tigray origin everywhere throughout the country are under attack. Tigrayans who were employees of the public sector they have been purged from their works, not only within Ethiopia, but even abroad. We know a lot of diplomatic Tigrayans who used to work at the embassies and other organizations representing Ethiopia as a country have been purged from their offices without any excuse whatsoever, apart the fact that Tigrayans and also people are being starved systematically. Their food is, it's even hard for me to speak about it, because this is such an inhuman thing. It's an active war. You very well know that people do not have access to cash, people do not have access to food. And so you're blocking the way that they could actually have gotten an opportunity to access some food and maybe increase their chance of survival. And so the purposeful blockage of food I think it's inhuman. And this goes to show the intention of the conflict. It's not just a war between two government parties, the government in Tigray and the central government. It's a systematic, this is an attack on the people of Tigray systematically. Our identity, the Tigrayan people's identity is under attack. The Tigrayan people's integrity and survival, our collective survival, is under attack. And so that's why you see some Tigrayans, including myself, saying that this is a genocide, because that's exactly what's happening. And people are being, according to reports that we're getting from Addis and elsewhere, Tigrayans are being congregated in interim camps, and that's very scary. You don't need to do that if your intention is indeed to only, capture some criminal political leaders. These people who do not have any affiliation whatsoever with the political party in Tigray, they're being congregated in interim camps. Their houses are being raided. They're being humiliated and dehumanized through government mouthpiece medias. And this goes to show you how deep the intention is, how what is being done is something that you would see in movies. It's very horrific. And the intention for me seems to be extermination of Tigrayans or ethnic cleansing. And so I wish the international community could understand how deep the crisis is and how great level of threat is, how the kind of threat that Tigrayans are facing in Ethiopia is it's very huge. And that's why there is a very immediate need for an action. And that's just something I wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of us were in disbelief when we saw that he was even going to go in there with an army and do a military operation. So now at this point, we're going to move on. Jenny is going to
add something, Christina.
Uh-huh.
I just want everyone to know that behind the faces, the older women without shoes, these are people's grandparents. They're our grandparents crossing the border. I also, again, want to emphasize that these are the descendants of one of the most powerful civilizations in the world. They have been in their ancestral lands for millennia. This is not, it's very demoralizing what's happening. I also think it's really important to nest what's happening in Tigray within the wider Red Sea region to understand why exactly we're constantly faced with issues related to conflict, to see the kinds of crimes that were perpetrated towards Eritreans further north. We have to be able to connect the dots to understand what's going on in this region, why, not just on the African side, but also on the Middle Eastern side, to see how policies at the international level, world superpowers, how the decisions that are being made up top, what it looks like when it comes down to community or individual fallout. It looks like little old ladies who deserve to be drinking coffee outside of their homes, running and limping towards a border. And we need to be more conscientious about who we choose to lead us in the United States and in countries that have a tremendous impact on people worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tsaga.
I appreciate that too, because I think one of the things that has really been overshadowed, I think, in this crisis is the actual human toll to this. Everybody wants to play armchair politician or armchair general, but the reality is that we're talking about lives here. For one, I can't picture 50,000 people. I don't know. I've been in certain areas where there has been thousands of people, but 50,000 people in front of you. Could you imagine what that looks like in terms of refugees? UN OSHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, says that there are about 1 million people within Tigray that have now been internally displaced because of this war. I can't picture 1 million people. So, behind all of these statistics, there are human lives, there are women, there are children, there are girls that are being impacted here, there are elders, there are people with all sorts of illnesses, and I think, the word genocide is a very important word here, because what's going on now, really, systematic dehumanization, systematic oppression. I mean, these things are the precursor to genocide, and genocide doesn't take place just because of state violence. And what we're seeing now is the federal government has really unleashed ethnic issues that have sort of been long brewing in the background between the Tigray and Amhara states, and they've sort of unleashed a lot of different ethnic tensions, which are leading to massacres and other reports of war crimes. And so what we're seeing now, and just to the point earlier, Dr. Zaga mentioned banks in Tigray are closed. To add insult to injury to this, anyone in Ethiopia who opened a bank account in Tigray, whether you are Tigrayan or not, doesn't matter, your bank account has been frozen. So could you imagine, there are stories, there are credible reports that we are all receiving of people who are trying to pay for surgeries and school or, travel or whatever, who suddenly are blocked from accessing their funds just because their bank account was opened in Tigray. And this includes university students too. Ethiopia's federal universities are sort of ethnic melting pots. They have students from different ethnicities in these public universities, and students who, or former students who were at Mecca University and opened bank accounts in Tigray, now living elsewhere in the country, have been blocked from their accounts. And so we are seeing, 2.5 years worth of dehumanization, terms like daytime hyenas and other things. I mean, this is eerily reminiscent of, cockroach in Rwanda or something. I mean, when you start to dehumanize the other, whoever the other is, you lose a sense of empathy, you lose a sense of humanity, and that is when you are able to commit violence against somebody with no remorse and without second guessing yourself. So when we strip people of their humanity, that is when all evil breaks loose. And so we're seeing that right now in Tigray, and it is extremely dangerous because, to the points mentioned earlier, this is really being the flames here are really being fanned at the highest level of government. You can't deny this, and even state media is involved here. The Prime Minister's press secretary is involved here, and so I mean, there's a lot here that we need to stop before it gets worse. It's already bad, but it can get worse, and this is why it's important for us to really stand up. And a lot of you have been asking the chat box just to address this, sort of like, what can you do? Obviously, money is the most important thing. Donate, donate, donate. I know Jen and Christina will talk about how much we are raising in this call, but donate, donate. UNHCR and others have phenomenal fundraisers going on right now. Build awareness, raise awareness in your social circles, social media, talk to your elected representatives in government. Also, the last two things are, some of these organizations in Sudan are looking for skills-based volunteers. So if you are, somebody who has a particular technical skill, whatever, if you're a health professional or whatnot, and you want to provide your actual expertise and be on the ground, some of these organizations are creating space for that. And then the last thing is non-cash resources. Even for girls and women, I mean, there is a severe shortage of things like sanitary pads. And so, we're seeing a huge shortage, not just of medicines, but other healthcare supplies and needs. And so supporting this work is going to be important if we want to really ensure that women and girls and all refugees are taken care of.
Thank you, Sam.
May I add one thing? I'm sorry to do that. I just want to say that there's an incredible role that the diaspora can play. I'm seeing, for example, diaspora, some members of the East African diaspora, the Horn of Africa, actually mobilizing to counter false claims or propaganda that's being perpetrated. I know that there are reports of looting that are happening, and there are members of the Eritrean community that are actively saying this is not right, it shouldn't be happening, don't buy this. I think that it would be wonderful if there were other members of the Ethiopian community, ethnic groups, that could also start looking at reports by those that are independently investigating, listen to the language of the people crying in the camps, try to take a step back and see, just assess the situation for what it is. Because your voice is incredibly powerful. Your voice is incredibly powerful. And under anyone, I will say, it is unfathomable to me that this type of collective punishment could be sanctioned not just by a state, but by its people. Because no one would want that to happen to them. So start like looking around.
Thank you, Dr. Tsaga, for bringing that up, the need of unity amongst all of the ethnic groups.
Not really unity, that's not realistic necessarily at this moment. Just call it what it is. Look at it for what it is.
Yeah.
I want to tell you about who brought you this information and this presentation today. We've had great panelists. I've been moved, and I'm sure many of you have been as well. It's the holiday season, and UN Women USA LA does these type of events. It's a coalition of people that believe in tackling international issues and supporting projects and work that the UN does. Gives you an opportunity to engage, to be part of this coalition. And I hope that if you like what you see here, you will come and join us.
Thank you to the panelists, Dr. Tsaga, Samuel, Maaza. Thank you to the UN Women USA LA for giving us a safe place to hold this conversation. Kathy and Jennifer for your guidance and mentorship. Thank you to the panelists who have been advocating from day one, and the many others whom are also being a voice for the voiceless. I see you. If I trust me, I would have. Thank you to my family. Thank you for teaching me my history, to be proud of where I come from and keeping me connected with my roots. I also would like to thank the many people who shared this event that I personally do not know. A lot of you reached out in ways that you could help. And so I am grateful for that. If it wasn't, I mean, it's because of you guys that we were able to do this event. So thank you.
And all of those who have made a journey and know the refugee experience, we honor you. Thank you, panelists. And for our final donation numbers, because it's something we got to do. Are you ready? Drum roll, please. $1,865. And through Eventbrite, we were able to raise $1,440, totaling magical threes, $3,335. If you ever feel like you can't be part of change, remember what you did here today. As a participant, as a panelist, and as a tenacious Christina who said, this is important, UN Women USA, you've got to listen to this, and we did. So thank you, everyone. You have made this possible. And we will do our absolute best to see that those most in need will receive these vital funds. Thank you very much.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much. And I also want to encourage everyone to continue using social media to advocate for the innocent and vulnerable women and people of Tigray who are being collectively punished. And please continue to use the hashtag Stop War on Tigray. It's very important. And let's also continue to be resilient and strong, because the diaspora has a role to play in amplifying the plight that our people are going through. And we can only do that if we take care of ourselves first, because the emotional toll of everything that's happening back home is quite devastating. So make sure you check on your family members, your friends, and then at the same time, let's continue to be the voice for our people that we have been trying to do so for the past 45 days. And there are so many reports coming up regarding Eritrean troops being involved, UAE Arab Emirates sending its drones. All of this we cannot corroborate independently, again, because there is no access to people back home, and also international media personalities are not allowed to enter to Ethiopia. So let's continue to push for that, and let's continue to be the voice for our people. And thank you so much for providing us this opportunity to at least try to shed some light on what's happening to Tigrayans back home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maza.
You know, just to add to that, I think, you know, one, thank you to everyone, but just two things really stick out. One is, you know, many of you in the diaspora ask, you know, sort of what can I do, what can be done? I think one of the first things that you can do is do what Christina did by reaching out to her local UN Women chapter to organize this event. And, you know, to Jenny's point, like if it wasn't for Christina, you know, this event would not have happened. The chapter probably would not have heard about it. I mean, this is a war that's being fought in the dark. So a lot of people are just not familiar with what's going on in Tigray or in the Horn of Africa right now. So do what you can. Reach out to your local Rotary Club, reach out to your local, I mean, like whatever, if you have a knitting club or a book club, your local organizations, your community groups. You know, a week ago, I spoke to Democratic Socialists of America chapter in New York about what's going on. So, I mean, you know, just whatever you can do to sort of reach out to your local community organizations to shed light on what's going on would be very important, not just for the awareness building, but also for fundraising and political action. And so I applaud members of the diaspora, especially you, Christina, and others, and just, you know, want to point out, although I don't have any scientific proof for this, a lot of the activism that I'm seeing in the diaspora is being led by women. And so I think that that's important to also share a lot of the organizing, a lot of the mobilization, a lot of the fundraising, a lot of the collection of resources, a lot of the social media action, and really, I mean, the overwhelming majority of the people that I communicate with in the diaspora on a regular basis who are leading in the awareness building of what's going on, they're women, and they're very strong-minded and they're very independent. And so I think it's incredible to note that, and just congratulations to all of you, including those of you that are watching this, and just keep the work, you know, keep the faith and stay strong.
Thank you, Sam.
To follow up on Sam's suggestion, don't forget the power of a letter to the editor by bringing it up in your local paper, and write to several different papers. It actually can get published on their social media. There's all sorts of websites that will help you on what it's called, LTE sample. Look it up. Make an appointment with your local with your local civil rights group. Meet with your local politician. Write a letter to your representative. These sort of things do make an impact. The power of the pen. And to the audience member that asked whether the text message donation line will still work after this event, yes, it will. Please share it far and wide. Thank you.
Want to put in my thanks too, if that's okay. Thank you all for including me and us in this conversation. I've been noticing that a lot of conversations that are happening about Tigray are not really including Tigrayans necessarily. Whether it be people in the diaspora or people, when I say in the diaspora, I mean people born or raised in the diaspora, or those that have more of a proximal experience with this type of conflict. Thank you for including our voices. It's an important and critical component to the puzzle. And to all of the Tagaru out there, don't give up. Ajohum. We have to keep building. This is a long-term game. It won't be easy. It's only just beginning. Keep building. We need to keep building. We need to keep working together so that not only do we find a way to restore or reestablish what was, but we build bigger and better. Let's learn from what didn't work and move forward in a more sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tsaga. It was very important to have the voices of Tigrayans during this panel discussion, especially women and our feminist Sam. So thank you.